The signal arrived at 3:47 hours on a dead man's frequency, and War-Marshal Vraeth Sho'kal knew before he opened it that everything his people believed about the war was about to break apart in his hands. It came from Outpost Meridian's Reach, a human colony his own fleet had burned to slag 11 days earlier. There should have been no one left alive to transmit anything. His sensors had confirmed 0 biological signatures before the withdrawal. His officers had logged it as victory number 41, a clean kill. A textbook execution of the doctrine of the unbroken line, the ancient Korrathi law that said a war not won swiftly and completely was not truly won at all. And yet here was a transmission, routed through 6 dead relay buoys and encrypted in a cipher his codebreakers had never seen, arriving not as a distress call, not as a surrender, but as an invitation. Vraeth read it twice standing in the dim observation deck of his flagship, the Ashcrown Vigil, with the reflected light of a nameless red dwarf crawling across the obsidian floor. The message contained no threats, no pleading. 17 words translated cleanly into High Korrathi as though the humans had studied his language for years rather than months. "We have something to show you. Come alone, bring your doubts." He should have deleted it. He should have flagged it as psychological warfare and moved on, because in 3,000 years no enemy species had ever dared address a Korrathi war-marshal with such casual familiarity, such absence of fear. But Vraeth did not delete it, because for the better part of a year now, something about this war had refused to make sense, and the wrongness of it had followed him into every waking hour like a splinter lodged too deep to remove. His people had won every single engagement against the human military for 11 months and 22 days. Every battle, every skirmish, every siege. The Korrathi fleets had shattered human formations at Calder's Rim, burned 3 border colonies to ash, boarded and captured 41 vessels, and driven the human defensive line back across 2 entire star systems. By any measure his people had used to calculate victory for 3 millennia, the war should have ended 8 months ago. The humans should have sued for peace or died or fled beyond the reach of Korrathi ships. Instead they kept coming back, reorganized, rearmed, refusing to break in a way that no defeated species in recorded Korrathi history had ever refused to break. And every month, the cost of winning climbed a little higher. He set the tablet down and looked out at the stars, at the long gray shape of his fleet arrayed in the dark like teeth in an open jaw, and he allowed himself, for the first time in almost a year, to ask the question his pride had refused to let him ask. So what if we have been winning the wrong wars? To understand what troubled Vraeth Sho'kal, you first had to understand what the Korrathi Dominion was, and what it had been for longer than human civilization had known how to smelt iron. The Korrathi were not conquerors in the crude sense. They did not raise worlds for sport, and they did not enslave the species they defeated. Their empire, if it could be called that, was built on something older and in its own way more absolute. The belief that strength was a language, and that any civilization unwilling or unable to speak it fluently had no rightful claim to the stars. 3,000 years earlier, the Korrathi had fought a war of near extinction against a rival species called the Osset, a conflict so total and so costly that it had reshaped their entire civilization around a single unbending principle. Never again would a war be allowed to drag on, to bleed a generation dry, to leave uncertainty where there should be resolution. Every conflict the Korrathi entered afterward was fought according to the doctrine of the unbroken line. Identify the enemy's core strength, strike it with total, coordinated, overwhelming force, and end the war in the shortest possible span of engagements. A war measured in years rather than months was not a war at all in Korrathi eyes. It was a failure of leadership, a stain on the war-marshal who allowed it, and historically a fast track to that war-marshal's quiet removal from command. For 3,000 years, this doctrine had never once failed them. 41 species had encountered the Korrathi Dominion in that span. 38 had capitulated within the first year of open conflict, recognizing that continued resistance only multiplied the cost of an already decided outcome. 3 had chosen annihilation instead of surrender, and the Korrathi, bound by the ancient silence accord that governed the wider galactic community, had been forced to accept terms of controlled disarmament rather than destruction, a compromise that still rankled the oldest war marshals as an incomplete victory. There had been a time in the earliest weeks of War when Korrathi analysts had genuinely believed the human military simply did not understand how badly it was losing. Battle after battle, human fleets arrived at engagements already outmatched, fought with a strange, disciplined restraint that never quite escalated into the desperate, all-or-nothing resistance the doctrine of the unbroken line had trained Korrathi commanders to expect from a dying species, and then withdrew in formations too clean, too orderly, too suspiciously intact to be the panic of a broken force. At the Battle of New Ostrava, the second major engagement of the war, human ships had disengaged after losing exactly the minimum number of vessels required to convince Korrathi censors the retreat was genuine, and Korrathi intelligence had spent weeks afterward puzzling over evacuation logs that showed every single civilian from the colony's surface accounted for and resettled before the first Korrathi shuttle ever touched down on the ash that had once been their homes. At the siege of Halcyon's Gate, a human garrison had held a position long past the point any rational commander should have continued fighting, only to reveal in the final hour that the position itself had never held anything of value at all. A decoy built at enormous cost to draw an entire Korrathi strike group away from 3 shipyards, it had never once occurred to Korrathi command to consider a priority target. Every one of these engagements had been logged, celebrated, and filed as another entry in an unbroken record of Korrathi dominance. It would take the better part of a year for anyone to notice that the record itself had become a kind of blindness. Humanity was supposed to be species number 42. Early intelligence reports had suggested an easy campaign. Humanity was young, scattered across barely 30 colonized systems, its military doctrine unrefined by comparison to Korrathi warcraft, its ships slower, its weapons less elegant, its political structure fractured across competing colonial governments that did not always agree on basic questions of defense. When the first Korrathi scout fleet crossed into the Calder Expanse 11 months and 22 days ago and encountered a human border patrol, the resulting engagement had lasted 4 minutes and ended with all 3 human vessels destroyed and 0 Korrathi losses. It should have been the opening note of a short, clean war. Instead, it had become the first data point in a pattern that no Korrathi strategist could explain. 3,000 light-years away, in a section of space the Korrathi Chinese letter FLEET charts marked only as unassigned territory, Border Zone 7, a woman named Mira Solano stood in a windowless briefing room aboard a station that did not officially exist, watching the same 11-month timeline scroll across a wall-sized display, and felt something that looked almost like relief. Threshold Station orbited nothing. It hung in the gravitational shadow of a collapsed binary system where no starlight reached and no long-range sensor array had any reason to look, sustained by a fusion core buried 3 kilometers beneath armored rock. Fewer than 400 people in the entire human sphere knew it existed. Mira had commanded its intelligence directorate for 6 years, long before the Korrathi Dominion had ever crossed into human space, back when her job had consisted mostly of cataloging rumors and half-verified signals from the edges of known space. She had not expected, 6 years ago, that the theoretical framework she and her team had spent a decade building would ever be tested against a real enemy. She had built it anyway, because some instinct older than her rank had told her that humanity's first true contact with an interstellar power would not go the way the optimists in colonial command hoped it would. She had been right, and the price of being right sat behind her eyes every night when she tried to sleep. "Confirmed loss count from Meridian's reach," said Ensign Tolly Ake, her youngest analyst, not looking up from his terminal. His voice carried the flat, exhausted register of someone who had delivered too many casualty reports to still flinch at the words. Civilian evacuation complete before the strike. 0 fatalities. Colony infrastructure a total loss. 41st engagement. 41st tactical defeat. And the message, Mira asked. Sent, relayed, and confirmed received 11 minutes ago. Their flagship pulled it out of a dead buoy exactly where we left it. Mira nodded slowly and allowed herself one long breath before the weight of what came next settled back onto her shoulders. On the wall display, a graph tracked 2 lines climbing in tandem across 11 months. Korrathi tactical victories, 41 and rising, an almost perfect staircase of dominance. And beside it, a second line, one that no Korrathi analyst had ever thought to chart, because no civilization in 3,000 years had ever given them a reason to. Korrathi resource expenditure per engagement, rising in a curve that had started shallow and was now bending sharply upward, engagement by engagement, month by month, exactly as she had designed it to. "They're finally going to ask the question," she said quietly. Toli looked up at her for the first time. "You think the War-Marshal is going to come?" "I think," Mira said, turning to look at the star chart glowing behind her, at the long dark road that had cost humanity 41 colonies, 11 months, and more good people than she would ever stop grieving, that we've spent a year losing every battle exactly so that he would have no choice but to come and ask us why. If you had asked anyone in Colonial Command a year and a half earlier what humanity's first interstellar war would look like, they would have described something out of old film reels. Fleets clashing in open space. Desperate last stands. A hero captain turning the tide with a single brilliant maneuver in the final act. Nobody in that room, and certainly nobody in the wider public, who would eventually learn only the barest outline of what had actually happened, expected the true shape of the war Mira Solano had spent a decade quietly preparing to fight. The theory had a name inside Threshold Station, one that had started as gallows humor among her senior analysts and eventually become doctrine: the hollow line. The premise was almost obscenely simple once you said it out loud, and almost impossible to execute without losing your nerve somewhere in the first 6 months. If an enemy civilization measured victory purely by tactical outcomes, by ships destroyed and territory seized and battles concluded quickly, then that civilization had built its entire strategic culture around a blind spot. It had never had to ask what winning cost. It had never had to develop the instruments to measure attrition on a decades-long timescale, because in 3,000 years, nothing had ever forced it to look past the horizon of its next clean victory. Humanity, Mira had reasoned, could not win a war of ships and firepower against the Korrathi Dominion. Their fleets were faster, their weapons more refined, their crews trained from childhood in a martial tradition 3 millennia deep. But humanity could, if it was patient and disciplined and willing to bleed in ways that never showed up on a Korrathi victory ledger, win a war of endurance, of cost, of political and cultural exhaustion. Every colony evacuated before a Korrathi strike was a tactical loss and a strategic preservation. Every ship that fled a losing engagement instead of dying with honor took its crew, its data, its hard-won intelligence on Korrathi tactics back to Threshold Station to be studied, refined, distributed. Every retreat that looked, on a Korrathi sensor log, like cowardice or disorganization, was in fact a carefully rehearsed withdrawal designed to cost the pursuing force fuel, ammunition, and wear on aging engines that Korrathi shipyards, built for short decisive campaigns, had never been designed to sustain across 11 straight months of continuous deployment. It worked because the Korrathi had never needed to ask whether it was working. Victory was self-evident to them. They had won 41 engagements. Only a fool would call that anything other than dominance. But somewhere behind that fleet of 41 victories, ships were breaking down faster than shipyards' 3 months' journey from the front could replace them. Veteran crews, trained over decades and treated by Korrathi culture as irreplaceable institutional assets, were dying in a campaign that should have ended in weeks and instead showed no sign of concluding at all. And in the ancient Korrathi political structure, where a war marshal's authority was granted and revoked by a senate of blades that judged competence by how quickly conflicts resolved. Whispers had begun, quiet and careful at first, then louder, questioning why War-Marshal Vraeth Sho'kal, hero of the Osset Reclamation, had somehow allowed an inferior young species to drag a supposedly decided war into its second year. Vraeth had heard the whispers. He had ignored them for months, the way a captain ignores a hairline stress fracture in a hull he does not yet have time to repair. But standing on the observation deck with the message from Meridian's Reach still open on his tablet, he could no longer pretend the fracture was not there. He thought of Threl Vantu, War Marshal of the 2nd Ash Fleet, a rival since their days as junior officers under the same mentor, a man who had spent the last 4 months positioning himself in the Senate of Blades as the obvious successor should Vraeth's campaign continue to stall. Threl had not said the word failure in open session. He had not needed to. He had simply asked in front of the full Senate how many more colonies the Dominion intended to burn before someone acknowledged that burn-in. The G colonies was not, in fact, ending the war. Vraeth had no good answer to that question. He had a fleet of victories and a mounting sense that every one of them had cost him something he could not yet name. He thought, too, of his old mentor, First Blade Asun Kathir, dead now 11 years, who had commanded during the final campaign of the Osset Reclamation, and who had told him once, in the quiet after that war's last battle, a thing Vraeth had never fully understood until now. Asun had said that the Osset had very nearly beaten them, not because the Osset fleets were stronger, but because in the final 2 years of that war, the Osset had stopped trying to win battles and started trying to make the Korrathi bleed for every single one, in ways too small and too patient for Korrathi doctrine to notice, until the cost had already become unbearable. It is not the enemy who breaks your line first that you should fear, Asun had told him. It is the enemy who understands that your line has a cost, and is willing to spend 100 small defeats teaching you what that cost is. Vraeth had filed the memory away as an old soldier's melancholy and never thought of it again in 11 years. He thought of it now, standing over a message that should not have existed, sent from a colony that should have had no survivors, inviting him to come alone and bring his doubts, as if the sender had somehow known exactly what doubts he carried and exactly how long he had been carrying them. He gave the order to prepare his personal shuttle within the hour. He told no one but his first officer, a steady, unimaginative man named Kether Asa who had served him for 9 years and who received the order with the particular silence of someone who has decided not to ask the question he most wants to ask. Vraeth did not explain himself. He was not entirely certain he could have. The coordinates in the message led to a location that existed on no Korrathi star chart. A stretch of empty space at the exact gravitational midpoint between 3 dead stars, chosen Vraeth would later understand, precisely because no fleet of either side could approach it without being visible from 100,000 kilometers away. It was neutral ground in the oldest and most literal sense, a place where no ambush could hide and no reinforcement could arrive unseen. Whoever had selected this location had understood something about trust that Vraeth found himself grudgingly admiring even before he had met the person responsible for it. His shuttle dropped out of transit space into a silence so complete it felt deliberate. A single human vessel waited for him there, small, unarmed as far as his sensors could determine, running lights dimmed to the barest minimum required for visibility. No escort. No hidden support fleet lurking behind the dead stars, though his sensor officer had scanned 3 times to be certain. Just one ship and one woman standing in an airlock viewport when the docking clamps engaged, watching him with an expression he could not immediately read, something between exhaustion and a strange, careful hope. She did not bow when he stepped aboard. She did not offer the ritual gestures of submission that 38 prior species had learned to perform in the presence of a Korrathi war marshal before their formal surrenders. She extended a hand in the human fashion he had seen only in intelligence briefings, and when he did not take it, she withdrew it without embarrassment and gestured instead toward a small, undecorated room with 2 chairs and a table between them, empty except for a single data tablet. Commander Mira Solano, she said, thank you for coming. You said I should bring my doubts, Vraeth said, choosing to speak in the trade dialect both species had developed over the preceding months rather than force her into a translation delay. I find I have brought a great many. Good, she said, and something in the plainness of the words surprised him more than any diplomatic flourish could have. That means you've been paying attention. Most of your people haven't. Sit down, War-Marshal. I want to show you something, and I want you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you I could have kept hidden for another 6 months. I'm choosing not to, and you should ask yourself why, because the answer matters more than the data does. He said nothing for a long moment, watching her with the careful, unreadable patience she was beginning to understand was not coldness but its opposite. A species that had learned over 3,000 years to think before it spoke, because it had rarely needed to speak twice. Show me, he said finally. She activated the tablet, and the two graphs Toli Ape had shown her hours earlier bloomed into the air between them. Korrathi tactical victories climbing in their clean, satisfying staircase, and beside it, the curve she had built from a year of painstaking, dangerous intelligence gather. Tracking something the Korrathi Dominion had never once thought to track about itself. Fuel reserve depletion across the 3rd and 5th fleets. Veteran crew losses not to combat, but to accumulated fatigue, equipment failure, and the slow erosion of morale that came from fighting a war that refused, against every historical precedent, to end. Shipyard capacity strained past sustainable limits for the first time in Korrathi military history. Political instability in the Senate of Blades. Tracked through diplomatic chatter, her intelligence networks had spent months quietly assembling from fragments most analysts would have dismissed as noise. You've won every battle, Mira said, watching his face rather than the display, because she had spent a decade learning that the truth of a moment like this lived in a person's eyes, whatever species those eyes belonged to. I'm not going to insult either of us by pretending otherwise. 41 clean tactical victories. Your doctrine says that should have ended this war 8 months ago. It hasn't, and I think you've started to understand why, even if no one in your command structure has said it out loud yet. You've been counting the wrong thing. Vraeth studied the curves for a long moment, and Mira watched 3,000 years of doctrine visibly strain against a single afternoon of evidence. You are telling me, he said slowly, that you have been losing on purpose. I'm telling you we redefined what losing means, she said. Your doctrine measures a battle by what happens in the 4 hours it takes to fight it. Ours measures a war by what happens over the 4 years it might take to win it. Every colony you've burned, we evacuated first. Every ship you've destroyed, we emptied of anything worth saving before we let it die. Every retreat your officers logged as human disorganization was rehearsed, timed, and designed to cost your pursuing forces exactly as much fuel and hull integrity as we could extract without losing a single additional life. You have won 41 battles, War-Marshal. We have spent 11 months building the single largest tactical dataset on Korrathi warfare that has ever existed, and we have spent it studying exactly how much your victories cost you, because we understood something about your people before we ever fired a shot back. And what is that? That you've never had to ask the question, Mira said. In 3,000 years, no one has ever made you count the cost of winning because no one has ever survived long enough to force you to. We couldn't beat your fleet. We knew that from the first 4 minutes of this war, so we decided not to fight your fleet. We decided to fight your economy, your shipyards, your veteran retention, and your Senate of Blades using your own victories as the weapon. Every battle you won made you weaker in ways your doctrine has no language to describe, and stronger in exactly one way that no longer matters: your win count. Vraeth said nothing for a long moment. Outside the viewport, the light of 3 dead stars fell across his face in a way that made him look. For the first time since Mira had begun studying Korrathi command psychology 2 years earlier, less like the legendary hero of the Osset Reclamation, and more like a tired man beginning to understand that he had spent a year fighting a war his own culture had never equipped him to see. "Show me the numbers," he said finally, and his voice had lost the formal edge it carried at the start of the conversation. "All of them. I want to understand exactly how badly you have beaten me, Commander Solano, because I suspect I have been telling myself a very comfortable lie for several months now, and I find I no longer have the patience for comfortable lies." She did. For the better part of 2 hours, she walked him through data her people had gathered at a cost she did not fully disclose to him that day, though she would later, when trust between them had grown into something closer to the beginning of respect. She showed him the fuel consumption models built from debris analysis at 19 separate battle sites. She showed him crew rotation patterns extracted from intercepted supply logistics, patterns that told her analysts, with uncomfortable precision, exactly how thin his veteran officer corps had become. She showed him a political heat map of the Senate of Blades built almost entirely from patient, painstaking analysis of diplomatic communications between Korrathi client species. Chatter that Korrathi security had never imagined a human intelligence network could access, let alone interpret correctly. And she showed him, last of all, the thing that had cost her more than any of the rest. A private log, recovered from a captured Korrathi supply officer during an engagement 8 months earlier. An officer who had died of his wounds before extraction but whose final data core had survived. In it, in his own hand, the officer had and what he believed to be a private complaint to a superior who would never read it. He had written that the war was bleeding the Third Fleet dry in ways no one back home would ever be told, because no war marshal in 3,000 years had ever had to explain a slow bleed to a Senate built entirely around fast, clean stories of decisive triumph. "I kept that log for 4 months before I decided to use it," Mira said quietly, "because it wasn't data anymore by the time I read it, it was a person. And I think that's the part of this you need to understand most, War Marshal, more than the fuel curves or the shipyard numbers. We didn't build this strategy because we don't value life. We built it because we value it more than your doctrine allows you to. Every single evacuation, every retreat, every colony we let you burn instead of defending it to the last soldier was a choice to save people over territory, crews over ships, futures over a scoreboard. You call it losing. We call it the only kind of winning that leaves anyone alive to enjoy it." Vraeth was quiet for a long time after that, longer than protocol or patience would normally have allowed, and Mira did not fill the silence because she had learned enough about Korrathi culture over the preceding year to know that silence for them was not emptiness. It was where the real thinking happened. "My mentor told me something once," he said finally, "that I did not understand until this hour. He fought in a war against a species called the Osset, nearly a war we lost, though history remembers it as a triumph because we recovered in the final campaigns and history is written by whoever survives to write it. He told me the Osset nearly broke us not through strength, but through patience, by teaching us the cost of our own victories one battle at a time until the lesson became unbearable. I dismissed it as an old soldier's grief. I understand now that he was trying to warn me, and I did not listen, because my doctrine told me there was nothing to listen for." "Doctrines are useful," Mira said, "right up until the moment they stop being true. The hard part isn't building one. The hard part is knowing when to set it down." There was a photograph on the wall of Mira's private quarters aboard Threshold Station that she had not shown Vraeth that day, and would not show him for several weeks yet, of a young man in a colonial defense uniform with her own dark eyes and an easier smile than she had worn in over a year. Lieutenant Dane Solano had died in the fourth engagement of the war, 8 months before his sister ever sat across a table from a Korrathi war marshal. Killed defending a supply convoy at Calder's Rim that the hollow line doctrine had on paper already written off as an acceptable loss. She had approved that loss herself. She had known from the earliest modeling her team had run that the convoy would very likely be sacrificed to buy time for a more critical evacuation 40 light-years away, and she had signed the operational order anyway, because the doctrine only worked if it was applied consistently, without exception, without the kind of quiet favoritism that would have let her divert extra escort ships to her brother's convoy at the expense of someone else's brother, someone else's daughter. Somewhere else in the war, she had told herself that for 8 months, she still told herself that, some nights it was even true. She had never told Vraeth this, not because she distrusted him, but because she understood something about grief that transcended species. That some wounds were not currency to be spent in a negotiation, even a negotiation as consequential as the one she was conducting. But the weight of it lived behind every word she spoke to him in that room, and perhaps he sensed it, because when their conversation resumed after a long silence, his questions had softened into something closer to the tone of one commander speaking honestly to another, rather than a victor interrogating the architect of his supposed defeat. If this story has you leaning in the way that quiet, guarded honesty was pulling War-Marshal Vraeth Sho'kal into a conversation he never expected to survive intact, take a second to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps a channel like this keep telling stories built around patience and consequence instead of just explosions. And here's a question worth sitting with before we go any further. If you were Mira Solano holding a strategy that would eventually save far more lives than it cost, but that cost included your own brother, would you have signed that order anyway or found some quiet way to protect him and told yourself the math still worked out the same? Drop your answer in the comments, because I've asked people that question before and the answers split almost exactly down the middle. Now back to that quiet room between the dead stars, because Vraeth was about to ask the question Mira had been dreading since he first stepped aboard her ship. "Why show me this at all?" he asked her. "Rather than simply continuing to bleed us until we broke on our own, you said it yourself. Your models suggested we could be worn down within another 8 to 14 months. Why surrender the advantage of secrecy now when you have not yet finished winning?" It was the question Mira had known he would ask, the one she had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing an honest answer to, because she had promised herself before this meeting that whatever else happened, she would not lie to him. "Because I don't actually want to win the way your doctrine defines winning," she said. "I don't want to bleed your dominion into collapse and call that peace. A war that ends because one side finally breaks isn't over, War-Marshal. It just goes quiet for a generation before someone's grandchild decides to finish it properly. I've read enough of your history now to know what happened after the Osset War ended in something less than total resolution. I don't want that for us. I don't want it for you either, honestly, and I'm aware that's an easier thing to say than to prove. I showed you this because I think you are the only person in your command structure who might actually be capable of choosing a different ending than the one your doctrine has been writing for 3,000 years. And because 11 months of watching my people die by inches so that your people could die a little more slowly than they otherwise would have has cost me more than I think you understand. And I am tired, War-Marshal. I am tired in a way that has nothing left in it for another year of quiet, patient bleeding, even if the numbers say we would eventually win." Vraeth looked at her for a long moment, and something in his ancient, weathered face shifted into an expression she had not yet learned to read on a Korrathi officer. Something that might, in a human, have been called respect or grief or perhaps both at once. "You understand," he said quietly, "that what you are proposing will very likely end my career and may end my life. The Senate of Blades does not forgive a war-marshal who returns from an unauthorized meeting with the enemy to announce that our doctrine itself is the flaw. Threl Vantu has been waiting 11 months for exactly this kind of misstep." "I know," Mira said. "I'm not asking you to hide it from them. I'm asking you to bring it to them, all of it. The fuel curves, the shipyard strain, the crew attrition, everything I've just shown you, laid out in a language your Senate cannot dismiss as human propaganda, because it will be built entirely from your own data, verified by your own officers, presented by the single most decorated war-marshal in 3,000 years, a man whose loyalty to the Dominion no one in that chamber can credibly question. I'm gambling that the truth, delivered by the right person, can end this war faster and with fewer graves on both sides than another year of patient bleeding ever could. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But I don't think I am, and I don't think you think I am either, or you would have deleted that message 11 hours ago instead of flying out here alone to hear the rest of it. Before Vreeth returned to his flagship that night, he asked her one more question, quieter than the others, one that had nothing to do with fuel curves or shipyard strain. The convoy at Calder's Rim, he said. Your intelligence briefings before I came here noted it among the engagements you had modeled as an acceptable loss. I read the casualty list this morning out of professional habit before I understood what I was looking for. A Lieutenant Dane Solano died in that engagement. Sharing your family name is either an extraordinary coincidence, Commander, or it is not. Mira did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice had none of the careful, measured precision she had used for every other sentence in that room. It's not a coincidence, she said. He was my brother. I signed the operational order that left his convoy without additional escort because if I had diverted ships to protect him, I would have had to explain to 40 other families why their sons and daughters didn't get the same consideration. I don't tell people that, War-Marshal. I'm telling you because I think you're the only person outside my own command who might actually understand why I had to. I do understand, Vreeth said, and for the first time since he had stepped aboard her ship, his voice carried something unmistakably close to grief rather than analysis. I have sent officers to their deaths knowing a different order might have saved them, and told myself the doctrine required it. I did not know until this moment that a species I considered too young to understand sacrifice had already learned that particular lesson as thoroughly as we have. A grief doesn't care what species is. Doing the grieving, Mira said. That's the part your doctrine never had to learn because you never lost slowly enough to feel it happen one name at a time. We did. Every name on that casualty list I know, every family someone on my staff has spoken to personally because I decided a year ago that if this plan was going to cost lives, it was not going to cost them anonymously. That's not weakness, War-Marshal, whatever your doctrine calls it. That's the only thing that kept any of us sane enough to finish what we started. The hardest part of Vraeth Sho'kal's war, it turned out, was not the one he had already fought. It was the one he was about to fight against his own people, for the right to admit the truth out loud. The Senate of Blades convened in a chamber carved from a single asteroid hollowed out over 4 centuries by generations of Korrathi stone rites. Its walls etched with the names of every war-marshal who had ever stood before it to answer for a campaign. Vraeth Sho'kal had stood in that chamber 11 times in his career, always to report a victory, always to a chorus of approving silence that was, among his people, the highest honor a commander could receive. He stood there now for the 12th time, and for the first time in his life, he did not know whether he would leave it with his rank intact. Threl Vantu sat in the second tier of the assembly, close enough to the front that his expression was visible to the full chamber, and Vreeth did not need to look at him to know that expression would be one of carefully composed anticipation. Word of the unauthorized meeting had reached the Senate within a day of Vreeth's return, exactly as he had known it would, because he had reported it himself rather than allow it to surface as a rumor that Threl could shape to his own advantage. You met with the enemy commander alone, said First Blade Yoron Kest, eldest member of the Senate and the closest thing the Korrathi Dominion had to a supreme arbiter of military conduct. Without authorization, without escort, and without prior report. Explain yourself, War-Marshal, before this body decides whether such an explanation is even owed. I will do more than explain myself, Vreeth said, and he activated the data core Mira had given him, the same core containing 11 months of Korrathi fuel curves, crew attrition records, and shipyard strain analysis, verified overnight against the Dominion's own classified logistics archives by 3 separate officers he trusted enough to bring into his confidence, each of whom had confirmed with visible discomfort that every figure the humans had shown him was accurate to within a fraction of a percent. I will show this body the true cost of the war we have been calling a victory for 11 months, and I will ask every member of this Senate to decide, honestly, whether the doctrine of the unbroken line has served us in this conflict, or whether it has simply prevented us from noticing that we are losing a war we believe we are winning. The chamber did not remain silent for long. Threl Vantu was on his feet within moments, his voice carrying the practiced outrage of a man who had rehearsed this exact confrontation in his private quarters for months. You would have this Senate believe the word of a human intelligence officer over 3,000 years of Korrathi military doctrine. You would have us abandon the unbroken line because an enemy showed you a graph and told you a sad story about her dead brother. He had not known about Dane Solano. Vraeth realized, with a cold clarity, that Threl's network of informants inside human space must run deeper than anyone in the Senate had previously acknowledged. And he filed that realization away as a problem to address later, because it was not the problem in front of him now. I would have this Senate believe our own logistics records, Vraeth said evenly, verified by our own officers, corroborating figures I did not believe when I first saw them, and which I have since confirmed independently at considerable personal cost to my own certainty. I did not travel to that meeting to be persuaded, First Blade Vantu. I traveled there to disprove what I suspected, and instead I found it proven beyond any reasonable doubt 3 times over. If this Senate wishes to continue calling 41 battles a victory, while our shipyards fail to keep pace with our losses, and our veteran officer corps ages out faster than we can train replacements, it may do so. I will not be the war-marshal who tells this body a comfortable lie simply because the truth arrived wearing an unfamiliar face. Other voices spoke that day besides Threl Vantu's, and not all of them sided against Vraeth. An elder blade named Soren Kavech, who had fought beside Vraeth's mentor decades earlier and who carried enough seniority that even Threl dared not interrupt her, rose midway through the session to remind the chamber, in a voice gone thin, with age but no less commanding for it, that the doctrine of the unbroken line had itself been born from a moment of humility rather than pride, forged in the aftermath of the Osset War precisely because an earlier generation of Korrathi leadership had been willing to admit that their prior way of fighting no longer served them. We did not become who we are by refusing to change, she said. We became who we are by changing once, at great cost, and then mistaking the doctrine that resulted for something eternal rather than something earned. I would rather my grandchildren inherit a dominion capable of changing twice than one so proud of changing once that it forgets how the lesson was learned in the first place. Her words did not end the debate, but they shifted something in the chamber's mood that Vraeth would later credit, more than his own testimony, with tipping the outcome toward the vote that finally came. The debate that followed lasted 11 hours, longer than any Senate session in over 200 years, and Mira Solano, watching a heavily filtered relay of it from Threshold Station through channels her intelligence network had spent months quietly establishing inside Korrathi diplomatic infrastructure, understood that she was witnessing something far larger than the fate of one war. She was watching an ancient civilization confront, for the first time in 3,000 years, the possibility that its most sacred doctrine contained a blind spot large enough to have nearly cost it everything. And she understood, watching Vraeth stand alone in that chamber against a rival who wanted his rank and a Senate that had never once in its history reversed a doctrine this fundamental. That she had placed the entire outcome of this war in the hands of a single man's willingness to choose truth over the comfortable certainties of a lifetime. She had not told him everything in that room between the dead stars. She had not told him that if the Senate rejected his testimony and moved to escalate the war under Threl Vantu's command, Threshold Station had a second plan already prepared, one considerably less patient and considerably more costly to both sides, built around exposing the full extent of Korrathi's strain not to the Korrathi Senate, but to the wider galactic community bound by the Silence Accord. A gambit that would likely end the war within months, but would very probably end Vraeth Sho'kal's career and possibly his life in the process, along with the lives of every officer who had helped him verify her data. She had gambled everything on the belief that it would not come to that. She sat in the dim light of Threshold Station's command deck. 11 months of careful, patient, devastating strategy balanced on the outcome of a debate happening 3,000 light-years away that she could not influence, could not interrupt, and could only wait for. When First Blade Yoron Kest finally called the chamber to order for a vote, the sun that gave the asteroid chamber its ceremonial name had turned twice across the observation windows, and Vraeth Sho'kal had not left the floor once, had not eaten, had barely allowed himself water, because he had understood somewhere in the fourth hour that the Senate was not simply weighing his data. It was weighing 3,000 years of identity against a single afternoon of uncomfortable truth, and he did not think a war-marshal, however decorated, had the right to look away from that struggle even for a moment while it happened. Threl Vantu spoke last, and spoke well, appealing not to the data, which by that point no member of the Senate seriously disputed, but to something older and more dangerous. The fear that admitting the doctrine had failed would mean admitting that everything the Korrathi Dominion had built its identity upon for 3 millennia was built on an unexamined assumption. If we say today that speed and totality are not the only measures of victory, he said, then we say that every war-marshal before us who died believing they had won cleanly may have been fighting a war whose true cost they never understood. Is that truly the legacy this Senate wishes to leave behind? A doctrine rewritten in the shadow of a single unfinished campaign against an inferior species. It was Vraeth who answered him, and his answer would be quoted in Korrathi military academies for the next century, though he did not know that yet. Standing exhausted on the chamber floor with 11 hours of debate behind him and no certainty at all about what would happen next. Every war-marshal who died believing they had won cleanly, Vraeth said, died having done the best they could with the doctrine they were given. I do not dishonor them by admitting the doctrine has limits their wars never tested. I dishonor them by pretending those limits do not exist simply because acknowledging them is uncomfortable. The humans did not defeat us through strength, First Blade Vantu and TH. I did not defeat us through trickery either, whatever comfort that accusation might offer this chamber. They defeated us through patience, through discipline, and through a willingness to value their own people's lives over the shape of a battle's outcome. 3 things our doctrine has never once required us to develop, because in 3,000 years no enemy has ever survived long enough to force the lesson. I would rather be the war-marshal who ends this war having learned something true about the limits of our own strength, than the war-marshal who wins a hollow victory and leaves the same blind spot waiting for whichever species finally has the patience to exploit it after us. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. Nothing in the Senate of Blade's 400-year history had ever been unanimous, and Vraeth had not expected this to be the exception. But it was decisive. Authorization for Vraeth Sho'kal to open formal peace negotiations with the human colonial command, under terms neither total surrender nor total withdrawal, but something the Korrathi Dominion had no ancient word for and would spend the following decade learning to call, in the careful language of the Silence Accord, a negotiated resolution between equals. The treaty was signed 6 weeks later, not in the Senate chamber and not aboard Threshold Station, but in the same quiet stretch of space between 3 dead stars where Vraeth Sho'kal had first heard the true shape of the war he thought he understood collapse into something larger and more honest than he had known how to imagine. Representatives from both Colonial Command and the Senate of Blades attended, along with observers from the wider Silence Accord community, several of whom, Mira noted with quiet satisfaction, seemed to regard the entire proceeding with the particular fascination reserved for events that would be studied by historians for generations. Vraeth Sho'kal retained his rank, though not without cost. Threl Vantu's faction would spend years afterward quietly working to undermine the terms of the treaty, and Vraeth would spend those same years just as quietly, patiently, and effectively defending it, understanding now something about the long game that his doctrine had never taught him and that he had learned in the end from an enemy who had become something closer to a colleague. and closer still in the careful, guarded way that survivors of the same war sometimes become to a friend. Mira Solano did not attend the formal signing ceremony. She remained aboard Threshold Station, watching the relay feed from the same command deck where she had spent 11 months building a war her own government had authorized but never fully understood. And when the treaty was finalized, she allowed herself, for the first time since her brother's death 8 months before this war had even properly begun, to weep quietly in the dark, where none of her analysts could see her and none would ever ask her to explain it. She met Vraeth one final time before he returned to Korrathi space for the long, difficult work of defending the peace he had helped build. He came aboard her ship without escort, as he had the first time, and this time when he extended his hand in the human fashion, she took it. "I have spent 3,000 years of doctrine trying to understand what it means to win," he said. "I find I understand it a great deal less than I did a year ago, and I believe that is the truest compliment I have ever paid an enemy." "We're not enemies anymore, War-Marshal," Mira said. "No," he agreed, and something that might in a human have been the beginning of a smile crossed his weathered face. "I do not think we are." Word of what had happened between Threshold Station and the Korrathi Senate of Blades spread slowly through human space over the following months, filtered carefully through official channels that revealed only the barest outline of the truth. Because some parts of the Hollow Line doctrine would remain classified for decades, and some parts, Mira privately suspected, would remain classified forever. Carried quietly by the small number of people who had built and executed a strategy that asked an entire species to accept a year of visible defeat in service of a victory too patient and too costly in grief to ever be properly celebrated. But the wider galactic community bound by the Silence Accord took notice in a way that Colonial Command had not fully anticipated. A species barely 30 colonies strong, young enough that older civilizations had expected it to either capitulate quickly or be quietly erased from the historical record within a decade, had instead fought the most disciplined, most patient, most quietly devastating campaign against a 3,000-year military doctrine that any member of the Accord could remember, and had done it not through superior weapons or overwhelming force, but through a form of strength. Many of the galaxy's older, more battle-hardened civilizations had simply never thought to develop. The willingness to value endurance over glory and people over territory, for as long as it took to be right. Humanity had not won the war the way anyone, human or Korrathi, had expected a war to be won. There had been no final decisive battle, no last brilliant maneuver, no moment where the tide turned in a single afternoon of desperate heroism. There had been 11 months of quiet, disciplined, grieving patience, carried by people like Mira Solano who bore the cost of every calculated loss long after the official reports had filed them away as acceptable, and by people like Vraeth Sho'kal, who found in the end that the courage to admit an ancient doctrine had failed required more strength than any battle he had ever fought. Years later, when historians on both sides finally gained access to the fuller record of what had happened during those 11 months, the war would come to be known by two very different names in two very different languages. In Korrathi military academies, it was taught, carefully and with no small amount of institutional discomfort, as the reckoning of the unbroken line, the campaign that had forced a 3,000-year-old doctrine to finally reckon with the cost of its own certainty. In human history texts, it was remembered more simply, and Mira Solano herself asked once at a much later ceremony what she believed the war should be called, had given an answer that outlived her in a way she never could have predicted. She had called it the year humanity learned that losing well was its own kind of strength, and that the species which finally earned its place among the stars would not be the one that never lost a battle, but the one that understood more clearly than any of its neighbors exactly what was worth losing for. It was not the kind of victory that made for easy celebration. But standing on the observation deck of Threshold Station months later, Watching the first joint human Korrathi survey vessel depart for the unexplored reaches beyond the Calder expanse under the terms of a treaty neither side had believed possible a year earlier. Mira Solano understood that it was, in the end, the only kind of victory worth having. One that left both sides not broken, but changed, and both sides, at last, willing to find out together what still waited for them among the stars. Somewhere behind that departing survey vessel, on a station that still did not officially exist, a new graph had already begun climbing across a wall-sized display, one Mira Solano had ordered built the week the treaty was signed. Not a record of battles won or lost, but a simple, quiet count of names, every person the hollow line had cost and every person it had ultimately saved, kept not as a trophy but as a promise, so that no future commander under her authority would ever again be allowed to forget that patience, however strategically brilliant, was only ever worth what it protected. She looked at it sometimes late at night, when the station was quiet and the weight of the year came back to visit her the way it always did, and she found, more often than not, that she could finally sit with it without looking away.